Hello everyone, this is Xiao. People usually define civilization by its grandest achievements, palaces, armies, laws, and writing. But a society's most revealing side often lies elsewhere, not in how it presents civilization, but in how it deals with filth. Because once human waste can no longer be managed in a stable way, the problem is no longer just the smell. What begins to break down is urban order, public health, privacy, and even the way power is imposed on the body itself. A toilet is never just a toilet. It is part of the way a society manages filth, organizes the public, and distributes dignity and burden. If Rome represented one answer, then its answer was this: to absorb filth into public infrastructure. China, for long stretches of its history, offered another: to absorb filth into systems of circulation and production. These two paths looked very different, but they were both trying to solve the same problem. Once people gather into cities, who deals with human waste, and how? Rome matters not because it makes us say, so ancient people had public toilets too. It matters because Rome incorporated human waste into urban infrastructure at a very early stage. The Roman world left behind some of the most famous public toilet remains in the ancient West. These were often multi-seat, open-plan facilities that operated alongside water supply, drainage, bathhouses, and sewers. By around the 4th century CE, the city of Rome is often said to have had more than 140 public toilets. The number does not mean equal access for everyone, but it is enough to show one crucial fact. In Rome, waste disposal was not just a scattered private nuisance. It had already become part of the city's infrastructure. Toilets, drains, sewers, bath complexes, and urban space were not separate structures functioning in isolation. They formed a system. And a system like this required far more than technical skill. It depended on concentrated physical capacity, engineering organization, and the governing power able to maintain public sanitation over time. Public toilets did not exist because people in one era simply cared more about cleanliness. They existed because the state and the city had the ability to absorb private waste into a public system. And once waste is absorbed into a public system, what gets redefined is not just filth itself, but privacy as well. In the Roman urban logic, sanitation was organized first as a public matter, not around the modern idea of personal privacy. That helps explain why Roman public latrines often lacked anything like modern stalls. Facilities built for mass use were designed first to accommodate collective use and continuous waste removal, not to maximize personal privacy for each individual user. That does not mean Rome had no concept of privacy at all. It means that the boundaries and priorities of privacy were very different from our own. Of course, this system was also supported by a pre-modern understanding of health and sanitation. That does not mean the Romans had anything like modern sanitary science. They clearly associated filth, foul odors, bad air, and unhealthy environments with danger. Rot, standing water, wetlands, and contaminated water sources could all be seen as threats to health. But this was not germ theory in the modern sense. It was closer to a pre-modern belief that the environment itself could make people sick. For that reason, Roman public toilets and sewers were not built simply to prevent disease. They also addressed the practical problems of urban life, controlling odors, maintaining public order, and reducing environmental risk. In that sense, Roman latrines were first and foremost instruments of urban governance, and only secondarily what we would now call sanitary facilities. But for all its scale, the Roman system was far from perfect. A large number of public toilets and impressive sewers did not mean they were enough to meet the daily needs of the entire population. Public latrines were only one part of Rome's sanitary reality. The other equally important part consisted of private toilets, chamber pots, cesspits, and various forms of waste disposal that depended on manual removal. Many private latrines were built over cesspits rather than connected directly to the public sewer system. And for many wealthier residents, linking a household cesspit to public sewer pipes could actually make things worse, bringing foul smells, vermin, and even dangerous gases back into the home. In other words, what Rome created was not a modern sanitary system equally shared by all. It was a mixed urban waste system, one in which public latrines, private toilets, cesspits, and manual cleaning all coexisted, working together to keep filth from spinning out of control. And that is precisely why Rome matters. It was not a city that had somehow conquered filth once and for all. What it shows instead is that the real challenge of a public sanitation system lies not simply in building it, but in sustaining it over time. And that kind of continuity depends on stable fiscal resources, organizational capacity, engineering maintenance, and enforcement. That is also why so many medieval European cities struggle to preserve anything like the Roman system. The problem was not just technological decline, it was also the fragmentation of the political and fiscal capacity needed to support public sanitation. Old infrastructure decayed, and no new maintenance system could fully replace it. The result was that filth became private again, irregular again, and increasingly disastrous. Waste was no longer steadily absorbed into an urban engineering system. Instead, it returned to streets, rivers, temporary pits, and all kinds of improvised private solutions. If Rome's answer was to absorb filth into public infrastructure, then for much of Chinese history, the answer was different. Not to flush filth away completely, but to fold it back into systems of production. In China, toilets, waste removal, and odor control ceased to be purely private matters very early on and began to enter the realm of institutions and public management. More importantly, for long stretches of history, Chinese society did not treat human waste as mere refuse. It was understood as a resource, something that could continue to circulate and be used. In an agrarian society, excrement was not simply something that had to disappear. It was fertilizer. It was tied to grain yields. It was a material that could be transferred between city and countryside. Han Dynasty pigsty toilet models provide especially vivid material evidence for this logic. The toilet sat above, the pigsty below, and human waste dropped directly into the space beneath, where it became tied to pig raising and manure production. To many modern viewers, the structure looks bizarre at first glance, but what really matters is the design itself. It bound together excrement, livestock, and fertilizer in a closed loop. In that system, waste was not simply waste. It was productive material that had not yet completed its circulation. This also helps explain why, in many periods of Chinese history, cities were not completely overwhelmed by filth even without a Roman-style sewer system. Urban waste could be sold to farmers outside the city, and once waste had value, someone would come to remove it. From the Song Dynasty onward, many East Asian cities developed increasingly professionalized systems for collecting, transporting, and selling human waste, which then re-entered circulation through agriculture. This night soil economy was neither romantic nor modern, but it was realistic. It meant that urban filth was not simply disposed of. It was sold back into the productive system. And once waste became a resource, what grew around it was not just a fertilizer market, but also occupations, territory, monopoly, and power. In Menglianglu, the line that many ordinary households in the lanes had no pit latrines and used only chamber pots not only shows that the term for chamber pots already existed in traditional Chinese usage, it also tells us that in southern Song cities, many residents were already relying on portable containers and organized waste collection to handle daily excretion. Waste was no longer just a private household matter. It had been drawn into an urban occupational network. This network did not begin as a neatly designed top-down institution. It emerged more gradually, driven by expanding cities, growing populations, and the rising value of human waste itself. At first, waste collection may have been little more than scattered labor. Whoever worked harder earned a bit more. But once the profits became stable, the right to collect waste could no longer remain at the level of whoever happens to do it. As early as the Southern Song, Menglianglu already suggests a system in which collectors had established relationships, and others were not supposed to encroach on them. The gazetteer draft of Beijing is even more explicit. It says that Beijing's waste workers had existed for a very long time and were originally scattered and loosely organized. But by the Kangxi period, with prolonged stability, population growth, and rising profits, they began to mark out boundaries and defend them. This, it says, was how the so-called Fendao came into being. What mattered here was not the street itself, but the kind of territorial claim attached to streets, households, and toilets, essentially a map of collection rights. Who had the right to collect from which area? Who could enter? Who could not? Who did the physical removal? Who handled the sale? And who could continue extracting profit from the waste produced in that zone? In other words, what was being contested was no longer just the labor of hauling waste, but the territorial rights and business control built on top of that labor. And once territory emerged, hierarchy followed. Not everyone involved in waste removal shared equally in the business. By late Qing and Republican Beiping, the industry can roughly be understood as having three layers. At the top were those who controlled the disposal rights and business rights, waste merchants and holders of collection territories. In the middle were those who operated waste depots and bought and resold waste. At the bottom were the waste workers who actually removed and transported it. Existing research makes clear that waste merchants hired waste workers to carry out the physical labor, while the merchants themselves profited from their monopoly over collection and disposal rights. So this was not a loose group of equal small traders. It was a hierarchical industry with differentiated control. Fendao was territory. The merchants controlled that territory and the rights attached to it, and the waste workers were the labor force that kept the whole structure running. So waste workers and waste merchants were clearly not positioned the same way within this system. Structurally speaking, the waste workers were the people most directly exposed to filth and most dependent on the arrangements made by those above them. The ones with real bargaining power were the merchants who controlled fendao and disposal rights. Once the waste produced in a given urban district could generate stable income, that district became something to defend, to compete over, and not easily surrender to others. Who was allowed to collect waste there? Who was excluded? Who could charge residents or demand extra fees? Who could sell the waste to farmers outside the city? And who could continue making money from the entire arrangement? All of these questions became, over time, questions of power. What emerged around waste disposal then was a very particular form of urban power. It was not glamorous power, nor respectable power, but it was stable, lasting, hidden, and real. Whoever controlled the right to handle filth also held a concealed but durable kind of urban franchise. By late Qing and Republican Beiping, this logic had become especially clear. As Shin Kyuhwan's research shows, waste merchants and the waste workers they employed enjoyed monopolistic control over urban waste disposal. They used their position to draw profit not only from the city itself, but also from the surrounding countryside, where human waste was needed as fertilizer. They could even threaten to stop working in order to extract extra payments. It was for this reason that residents of Beiping referred to them as feces lords or waste bosses. That label did not mean they were literally some kind of underground gang. It meant that the power they held had taken on a distinctly monopolistic character. It was not visible or prestigious, but it controlled one of the city's most unglamorous and least dispensable basic services. The state could not simply do without them, because they were performing one of the dirtiest and most necessary jobs in urban life. Of course, the state was never completely absent. It did not necessarily step in to manage every bucket of waste itself, but it did recognize, regulate, and occasionally reorganize these disposal rights. From the state's perspective, this was dirty work, scattered work, daily work, and expensive work. For that reason, the long-term solution was often not to take over the entire system directly, but to allow private actors to run it and intervene when necessary. That is precisely why the waste trade remained in such a peculiar condition for so long. It was neither a purely private business nor a fully state-run system, but something in between, a layer of urban order built on the management of filth. And this reintegration of human waste into the productive system shaped more than urban sanitation. It also shaped people's ideas about animals, food, and cleanliness. From that perspective, it becomes easier to see why the pig became entangled in the larger story of toilets and civilization in Chinese history. Pigsty toilet structures reinforced the cultural association between pigs and filth, and that may have been one factor behind the relatively low social status of pork. Mutton long occupied a higher culinary status and was favored by elites, while pigs were easier to raise and more closely associated with commoners. Even by the Song period, Su Shi's remark that the rich refuse to eat it and the poor do not know how to cook it still suggests that pork ranked below mutton in social esteem. Pigsty toilets did not single-handedly determine the status of pork, but they did make the association between pigs and filth especially durable. In the end, placing Rome and China side by side is not about declaring one civilization superior to the other. It is about seeing more clearly how different societies responded to the same problem of human waste in very different ways. And modern sanitation has not really brought that problem to an end. It has only made it more hidden. Today, sewers, flush toilets, and wastewater treatment plants make filth appear to vanish automatically. But in reality, they simply hand the work of managing waste over to larger public systems, more specialized technical personnel, and forms of urban governance that are far more expensive to maintain. Filth has not disappeared from systems of production and governance. Its treatment, disposal, and partial reuse have simply been pushed into places most people never see. So the progress of civilization has never meant that filth disappeared. It means that a society finally developed the capacity to absorb filth in a stable way into systems, responsibilities, and divisions of labor.